All right, folks, so now we're going to talk about isolation and what that can do to a population. So if a population can't mate, genetic differences may accumulate, which leads to speciation. And what types of isolation we're going to talk about are temporal, geographic, and behavioral. So temporal is like reproduce at different times of the year. Geographic is when populations are separated by geographic barriers like mountains or oceans. And behavioral isolation is when you have different courtship rituals or behaviors, like mating rituals, that many species have, even humans. Okay, so geographic isolation. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Geographic isolation is depicted here as simply as it can be. This river separates these two fox species. Over time, as these individual species, this one on the left and this one on the right, mate with their respective populations on the environment in the left and the right, their allele frequencies are going to change. They are going to diverge from each other. We're going to have divergent evolution and over time new species created because they're not allowed to intermate and be one or interbreed and be one population. Then you have behavioral isolation. That can be when you have a particular species like birds, which are very well known for their very specific, very obvious, and very over the top mating rituals. Sometimes certain mating rituals are not as well received by the opposite sex as others, and therefore an organism or a type of bird in this example can be isolated behaviorally from reproduction, from passing on their genes. And then there's temporal isolation. Temporal isolation is a great example as types of flowers that bloom at different times of the year, right? The pollen from one flower can't land on the pollen of another flower if that flower isn't in bloom like we see here. So these two would never interbreed. Their allele frequencies, their genetics, their DNA will continue to diverge because they won't interbreed and create hybrid offsprings, because they are separated by time. All right, folks, what I want you to do is I want you to click on this link called Understanding Phylogeny. And it's going to take us to a few steps here. And we're just going to read through these, please, for me. And then we'll talk about phylogeny. So, let's talk about speciation. Speciation is when a new species arises. A species is an organism that can reproduce and have fertile offspring. Basically, you have a gene pool, okay? And it's represented excellently here with these literal duplicated chromosomes jumping into a pool. The definition of gene pool. A gene pool is the total genetic diversity found within a population or a species. A large gene pool has extensive genetic diversity and is better able to withstand changes posed by the environmental stresses. Interbreeding contributes to the creation of a small gene pool and makes populations or species more likely to go extinct when faced with some type of stress. That's what interbreeding does. So that is the definition of a gene pool. And I'd like you to read more about what happens when the gene pool is limited. All right, remember, from our keystone question, our practice question with trait 1 and trait 2, it's bad if that trait 2 completely vanishes from the population, because what if something happens in the environment and that trait 2 is suddenly favored and we don't have it as a species anymore? Remember, when it comes to the species, the individuals don't matter, the population and the species as a whole matter. So we need that trait to keep the species going. Okay, so this is basically just comparing allele frequencies over time, over generation. So we have generation 1, 2, and 3. And if we look, the allele frequencies, 70% of these have big R, 30% have little r. And then in the second generation, where only 5 plants leave offspring, now it's a 50-50 in allele frequency, dominant and recessive Rs. And then, if only 2 plants leave offspring, now it's 100% big R, all dominant, and 0% recessive little r. Okay, you can see how this affects the gene pool, right? Because remember, these letters represent alleles. Alleles are genes, and genes are carried on chromosomes. So our gene pool has shrunk over time due to limited reproduction and reproduction within this population and not branching out. So we talked about divergent evolution, and now we're going to talk about convergent evolution. Organisms that are not closely related, they evolve independently with similar traits because of similar environments. So let's read about this case here on convergent evolution, and then I want you to tell me, when we be able to answer this question, how do you know that a sunbird isn't a hummingbird? Okay, now convergent evolution, again, means they're coming to a peak. They're coming closer together. But these are unrelated species. They're not the same species, but their environments are so similar that they're evolving in similar ways because the environments are selecting similar traits. Analogous structures, like vestigial, like homologous, they show separate evolutionary origins, but superficially similar because they evolved to serve the same function. So think about this. You have the wing of a bird and the wing of a bat. They're both wings. They both do the same function, but on their exterior they look drastically different. Okay? That is an analogous structure. So slow changes of evolution over time is called gradualism, all right? And gradualism, this is where we see very, very slow changes, but rapid changes separated by no changes over time is called punctuated equilibrium. Like it happens in spurts, whereas gradualism happens slowly over time. It's like a slow grade on a hill, whereas punctuated equilibrium is like mountains and valleys, mountains and valleys. And then ultimately you have extinction, and this is the state or process of a species, family, or larger group becoming extinct. I want you to read more on extinctions and understand the definition between threatened, endangered, and extinct. And we'll talk about why evolution matters now on Friday. Thanks, folks.